Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. For entirely fortuitous, cosmic convergence, alignment kind of reasons, this is Deep Cut Tuesday, because I just finished doing a podcast with the second guest of the Remnant Podcast, Yuval Levin, on his new book. And now I have the first guest of the Remnant Podcast, a PhD in history from Yale, I believe, one of those pointy-headed schools. He has been known to hawk various comestibles at University of Nebraska games. He's driven an Uber. He was also, for a time, a United States senator, which we don't like to talk about very much. And he is now the president of the University of Florida, none other than Ben Sasse. Ben, welcome back to the Remnant.
Dude, thanks for having me back. I'm excited. By the way, your backdrop says, I'm sure it says the Dispatch, but from where I sit, it just says the Patch. And it feels like either you're trying to quit smoking tobacco or you've gone to a new kind of birth control. There we go.
Why do I have to pick one? So, dude, how is it not being in Washington?
Oh man, it's an important calling. I'm glad some people are there, but I'm so happy about the new life. The only thing I miss about my old life, besides some friends, is Intel, and I'm still able to moonlight a tiny little bit, helping out in a few places in the Intel community. So given that that's the only thing I was going to miss, I feel like I got a pretty great stardust moment in that we got to transition to something where every day we get to work our tails off, but make a real difference for humans.
Yeah. So I was down in Gainesville a couple months ago. You were in Germany, of course. And I got the tour. Our mutual friend, guy who works for you now, Kurt Dudas, gave me the full University of Florida tour. He's gone native very quickly. You could tell he's gone all elbow patchy academic because he immediately starts talking about architecture on the campus. And
he goes from Greenwich and moves to Gainesville and buys a giant Ford F-150. I was so proud of him.
And I gotta say, it's an impressive situation down there. I mean, you're basically like the CEO of like 5 major organizations, because it's not just the school, it's the hospital system, it's the there's that football thing that you guys do. How do you divide your time down there?
Well, you know, there's that old joke that the government used to be that thing that tried to secure fundamental rights and ran an army if you needed to, and had a few social safety net programs on the side. And over time, the government turned into a giant insurance company that just happens to own a Navy. The analog joke in academia is I'm CEO of an 11 hospital, 6 campus, $6 billion a year medical system, and we operate some professional sports franchises. And every once in a while, you get to think a little bit about education.
So we should probably start with the sexy stuff, which is to say, you know, there's been towards the end of the school year, there were some protests on some campuses. And by protests, I mean illegal occupations of buildings and various would-be pogroms and whatnot. And you guys sort of set yourselves apart as going a different way. Why don't you just sort of explain how you see that?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on a team of folks who want to think about first principles and then, you know, what rules you communicate and how you enforce them. I think you should have a limited number of rules, but rigorously enforce them. And I'm a First Amendment zealot. And so we all have freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, protest, or redress of grievances. But we also have time, place, and manner rules. And so there aren't protests indoors. According to the statutes of the state of Florida. Maybe I should back up and say Florida's kind of a weird place. We have 12 public institutions. Well, we can do Florida Man jokes for the whole hour if you want. In fact, let's be sure we spend a little time on Florida Man jokes. But The University of Florida is weird in that it's both the flagship and the land grant. In most states, you're either UVA or VA-Tech, you're Texas or Texas A&M, but we happen to be both of those in the same institution. So we grant the PhDs in philosophy, English, history, or whatever, but we also are the land grant campus that is in all 67 counties. So sometimes we call it a campus, sometimes we call it an agricultural extension office for different regulatory reasons. But the University of Florida is in 67 counties, but the mothership where we live, the main campus in Gainesville, we have 2,200 contiguous acres and 86,000 human souls at this institution at the main campus. And according to the laws of Florida, our campus is actually a public park. So when you think Hyde Park, London, and the most extreme versions of, Speaker's Corner and standing on a box and shouting, outside we are a park and you can do all that stuff. And I'm going to vigorously defend the rights of people to say anything, even stuff that I find offensive or other people might find offensive. But that doesn't mean that you get to build an encampment. So other people don't get a camp on campus and sleep outside. At a University of Florida football game, we have specific rules about how tailgating works. And so there might be camping allowed. But in general, you can't just go pitch a tent on our campus today. So why, because people are protesting something, do they get to avoid and violate that rule? And so we decided to just be really clear. We're going to defend your First Amendment rights to speech and assembly and protest, but it looks like this, and these aren't hard rules to comply with. But if your desire is to get arrested, ultimately you're going to get arrested. But our desire is not to arrest you. It's to help you come into compliance. So we made very clear what it looked like to be able to protest. Again, oftentimes with positions that I find really morally repugnant. But people could protest, but they couldn't build a camp. And as soon as you made the rules that said you got to be holding your sign, and you're not laying down with pillows and sleeping bags and sleeping here, you can't bring in permanent structures, you can't set up a perimeter wall and start acting like Chaz or Chad or whatever the stupidity was in the Pacific Northwest that kept changing its name. You can't do that kind of stuff. Most people quickly got on board, and we shrunk from 120 people at some of our protests down to about 25 or 30. And most of those 25 or 30 obeyed the rules. And those that didn't, they got arrested and they're prohibited from being on campus for 36 months. So, it's going to be pretty unlikely that those folks graduate.
So I understand University of Florida, it's a park. It's a state institution. We can talk about the fact that you have alligators on campus, which I really just don't approve of. Awesome.
So can we just stay there for 1 second? Everybody, all your listeners, since I'm a listener, I feel like I'm with my people. Everybody needs to come visit this campus in Gainesville. It's pretty extraordinary. When you think who has elite academics and who has elite football, it's kind of Michigan, us, Texas. There just is not a list of dozens that have both great student experience and great academics. But I don't think people realize how special the weirdness is of North Florida swamps. And so when we survey our alums, 10 years after they leave, what do they remember most on campus physically? Is it a classroom? Is it Century Tower? Is it what we call the Swamp, which is the name of the football stadium, Ben Hill Griffin? What they remember most by 5X is this place called Lake Alice, where there are all these trails on the edge of this big swamp, and there are all these bat houses, and there are all these research labs around growing 250 commodity crops, higher quality, lower cost. And it's where all the alligators live. It's where people hold hands and propose to each other, and it's glorious. And you got to come to love your inner lizard brain, Jonah.
So since you want to stay on this, have there ever been fatalities or severe injuries from alligators on campus?
I mean, what happens at Lake Alice stays at Lake Alice. I mean, we don't want to arrest you, but if you want to be arrested, we'll comply. And the alligators don't want to attack, but if you're drunk after a fraternity party and you want to lose a few digits, the alligators will comply. The most important thing is you should not walk your favorite dogs within about 15 to 20 feet of the shoreline. So alligators are lazy as heck. They will not pursue you for 100 yards.
Right.
But if you're within, 12 or 15 or 18 feet, a full-grown alligator, average size is about 9.5 feet long, and they can spring off that tail really, really fast. And so you don't want to be within about 2 lengths of them. But if you're 25, 30 yards away, you got absolutely no risk. But they definitely love to eat Fido.
Yeah. that was one of the reasons why I was telling you before we started recording. You know, I was in the Jacksonville area for a while during COVID, and it was just way too stressful to be walking the dogs. Because like even like stupid rain ditches in the back of a mall, you don't know if there's an alligator there. And I got this dumb spaniel that wants to get wet all the time, and it just I just have too much invested in sort of IP in this spaniel to just give it to some Florida gator.
I understand.
Back to the speech stuff for a second. All right, so I understand that you're the president of the University of Florida and you have special obligations under the law because it's this mass sprawling public institution. But take that hat off for just 2 seconds. I can't say that I have a coherent position on this. I just know that there's a position that I have more respect for than a lot of my friends do. I like free speech. I'm in favor of free speech. I like the First Amendment. First Amendment, rah, rah, good. Let's not do anything to screw it up. At the same time, it just feels to me that, like, I also believe in honor codes and good citizenship, particularly on a college campus. And again, I understand it's different for a private institution than a public one. But isn't there room to say that, like, well, you have every right to shout all sorts of stupid Marxist ideas and whatnot, screaming gas the Jews or that kind of thing violates an honor code, even in some sense, that there should be the ability to punish that in some way. Again, on a private school, not a public one, but like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think you're pointing at two really important distinctions. What is specifically prohibited versus what is uncivil in a way that we should all say, come on, you're an ass. Like, don't do that. And then the public-private distinction, so that we can have a 2x2 there. I think publics have to stick at the legal on almost everything we're talking about. Right. But I think when you say, what does good neighborliness look like? And in Tocquevillian America, where most institutions are not and should not be state institutions, of course, there's lots of room for honor code and saying, these are the requirements of this community around this dinner table. We talk like this when we differ with each other. So I agree with both of those distinctions, but I'll add a third one. I am a First Amendment zealot. And yet I think most of the discussion around these things that focuses on freedom versus compulsion, most of the power discussions miss the more fundamental thing that's relevant right now, which is education happening? Right? There's just a lot of idiots. Mm-hmm. And we have a ton of people screaming from the river to the sea. Which river, which sea? What are you talking about? And where do the folks go? 15 million Jews on earth, roughly 7+ in Israel, 7 in the US, and 1.5 million everywhere else. And if you know any history of how we got to this moment, what do you mean by saying from the river to the sea? And the vast majority of the people saying this kind of stuff, I suspect are not really as morally repugnant as it sounds like. They're just incredibly dumb and lazy intellectually, and they don't know what they're talking about. And the universities that have faculties saying, no, we're going to stand up and say under shared governance, we're going to tell the administration there can be no punishment for having built an encampment on campus because this, that, and the other thing about academic freedom or free speech. Why are you as a faculty not first saying, why is somebody this stupid matriculating at our school, proceeding through the school at an average GPA of 3.8 at a lot of Ivy League schools now, and graduating with honors? Did you not think it was important to actually do some education while they were there?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. There was that great piece early on after October 7th in the Wall Street Journal where this guy did surveys and focus groups, and he asked young people do you agree with river to the sea? And then they said, okay, now what river do you think it is? And people were naming like the Caribbean as the sea and the Hudson as the river,
As a river, the Caribbean is underappreciated.
And there's just a lot of stuff between the Hudson River and the Caribbean. But my point is like, if you were on a college campus, again, private college campus for the sake of argument, but though I could make an argument about a public one, and you just shouted sort of the N-word all the time in the middle of the quad at people, at black people, or you shouted kike at Jews or something like that. To me, there's this argument about citizenship, and character, which I think are really, really important. But I think institutions have notions of citizenship and character and should be allowed to enforce them. And when you, and so the problem, part of the problem that you get with a lot of the anger over the stuff we've seen since October 7th was the selective enforcement thing. If you had said,
Yep,
men can't get pregnant, you'd get sent to re-education. But if you said, you know, the perfidious Jews run the world and they're all baby killers and all that kind of stuff, well, that's just important free speech, and that, the Holocaust didn't kill enough. Well, that's a perspective that you have to, even if you disagree with it, you have to honor. And so the selective enforcement of free speech rules actually means you don't have free speech, right? Behind every double standard is an unconfessed single standard. And it seems to me like we're already in the midst of promoting one worldview, this sort of, call it woke for the simplicity's sake. What's wrong with an institution saying, let's promote a different worldview about like sort of basic decency, Judeo-Christian standards, notions of good conduct, and the kind of speech we're going to police is grotesque, bigoted speech, and so be it. I mean, again, I'm stating it a little stronger than I actually believe it, because I understand it's complicated, but there seems to be this thing lost that institutions aren't allowed to cultivate, to mold character in any meaningful way anymore. Like honor codes are sort of like vestigial organs at this point.
Yeah, I think, again, to underscore 3 or 4 different distinctions you drew. So I'll just be redundant so that I'm not misinterpreting.
Well, I just want to hear you say 2 by 2 again, because I miss it so much. It's been so long.
We're going to do 2 to the 4th power, brother. We're going to go full McKinsey nerd for a while. Public versus private, we just need to underscore public institutions are held to a different standard, and free speech is not the point of even a public university, but it is essential to a healthy public university so that we understand that tax dollars are not being used to compel people in a way that violate free speech. That said, America is healthier if we have lots more institutional pluralism, and the vast majority of these institutions should be private and should be able to pursue very different purposes and standards, but under the larger auspices of, when we use the word university, we mean a couple things related to the creation and dissemination of ideas, of knowledge, right? And so research shouldn't be an excuse for an institution to not do great education. Most of the 5,000 four-year accredited, there are 5,000 four-year accredited schools in the country. Most of them are not really doing a lot of research. There's a set of values and criteria that should govern the research side of an enterprise. But what we're really talking about here, now I think we're at 2 to the 2 to the 2. What we're really talking about here is the educational mission of mostly private institutions that serve 18 to 22, 23-year-olds in a world where we don't really have many coming of age institutions. And you're absolutely right that very few of them take seriously the high calling of moral molding and melding of souls that are going from being kids to being adults. And we don't, when I think of my kids are turning 23, 20, and 13. When I think about their lives, there are not 100 schools that I would say are worth a year of their life, let alone 4 years of their life. If you said to me that money is no object and network is no object, they could, from age 18 to 22, I can help shape my kids' experience and we can get them into any room on the globe and you don't have to worry about money. If you had the complete freedom to spend those 4 years in a special way, one of the only things I'd bet on pretty early is I'd never commit to one zip code for the whole 8 semesters. The world is too big, broad, and interesting. There's too much work to do. There's too much travel to do. There are too many different kinds of books to read in diverse dining rooms and around seminar tables. And you ought to be able to say, oh, holy crap, you got 4 years of time and you can give them to your kid. That place is really special. And that place is really special. And that place is really special. And there aren't many of them that do that because they're way too thin, because they don't take seriously the calling you're talking about that flows from words like honor and virtue.
So a couple of years ago, I had Brian Kaplan on here, and he wrote a book called The Case Against Education. It was really about college education. And one of the things I don't go as far as he goes, but one of the things he's kind of persuasive about was that the sheepskin effect, right? That you're basically the thing that you're getting when let's pick on Princeton, because we got to pick on somebody, right?
Crazy the reunions. If you go to the reunions, the coats are nuts.
So they he ran the data. Like if the education was the value proposition, right? If what you were getting out of your 4 years at one of these Princeton-like schools was the value proposition, you would think the salaried returns on going for 7.5 semesters would be 7.5, something close to, semesters worth of the value that someone who did 8. But it turns out that no, it's the credentialing thing. It's the network effects. And, and he makes this really great point is like, would you rather have a degree from a survival school that teaches you how to survive on a deserted island? Or would you rather have taken 90% of the courses for it, but didn't get the degree? And in that scenario, you want the 90% of the courses that actually tell you how to get like water from a cactus and whatever. You don't give a rat's ass about the degree. But we're living in a society now where the bulk of the value is actually just in the piece of paper rather than the stuff that you're taught. How do you think about that? How does AI, do you think, going to change some of that? How do you approach that at the University of Florida?
Yeah, 3 big questions there in a row at the end. I mean, first of all, I think the Ivy League is trading on an old brand and on network effects. And I think that it's highly unlikely that the top 12 to 15 branded schools today are anything like in the pole position place 20 years from now that they've been in for the last 50 years. I think they're squandering things really rapidly, and they don't understand that brand can erode, and I think is in the process of eroding. Second, the bundle that you're talking about the sheepskin effect, I think Brian's work is really important. You and I were talking about something different about moral formation.
Sure, but I was just changing the topic on you.
Yeah, no. I think that there are 2 broad things happening when you go away to college from 18 to 24, right? Or 22, but average time to degree at a lot of state universities is 5.5 years. There is a preparation for work, half of what you're doing, and there is a preparation for life, half or part of what you're doing. And we should admit that those bundles don't have to fit together exactly like they do. I think, if you become a great welder and you traveled the world and read a bunch of books and had a few deep friendships, what the heck is the point of doing a 4-year bachelor's program? Like that you can unbundle and mix and match in different ways. And to your AI question, I think that's likely to happen. I don't think it happens fast because of the network effect points you're making. In fact, maybe it's worth having some demography in common. 5,000 4-year schools in the country, but 2/3 of them are something different than a comprehensive institution. I have a culinary institute. It's mostly 9-month programs, but I have 1 4-year program, so I show up on the list. But there are really 1,600 comprehensive schools. Almost all of them want to fake that they're selective. But the reality is, recording today, June 11, if you want to get your kid or niece or grandkid into a school 60 days from now, you can get into 1,550 of the 1,600 schools 60 days from now. So people fake selectivity, but they're really only about 50 schools that are actually at all selective. And so that Chivas Regal effect and that sort of country club, we're cool because we exclude people effect, I think that's usually crap. Like, I don't think that's usually a good proxy for what's important in the world. Really meaningful experiences want to let ambitious, hardworking, entrepreneurial people come join their community and both gain from and learn from it. So I think we should reject the false binary that education either prepares or enriches. We want a great education to do both of those things. And I think the opportunity to use AI to expand and tailor the preparation side of education is going to be really great. I think what you see happening in universities is a complete abandonment of any of the actual rigor of assessment. Average GPA at Harvard now is 3.8. And it appears, we don't have hard data on this, but it appears that the average SAT scores during the period of non-selective admissions during COVID and test optional period, I bet you Harvard doesn't have top 25 SAT scores in the country right now on their inbound kids, and they're given an average GPA of a 3.8. The corporation has done some really important stuff the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, looking like the pendulum may swing a tiny little bit. But I think Harvard is emblematic of institutions that have squandered a lot of capital really, really fast. And if you have an average GPA of 3.8 and a lot of the kids were not really getting in through some very rigorous filter, employers, which are a huge part of why the workforce preparedness parts of the legacy brand work, are going to say, this is not worth it. And so I need some external validation. I think you're going to see a lot of the competency-based stuff have more and more external validation of whether or not anybody actually knows anything. Again, this is not the only, I'm a history professor by background. I don't think that pre-vocational is the only or the primary purpose of age 18 to 22, but the pre-vocational part that does exist, these schools have done an incredibly crappy job. And I think the AI and quantification revolution is going to do a lot of great stuff in life in general. I think it's also going to bring a lot of universities to account over the next 2 decades. I think AI will help with high frequency, low stakes quizzing for accounting really, really well in a way that'll demonstrate whether or not people are prepared to be an accountant. And right now, I don't trust most schools that give people a 3.8 GPA just for showing up.
Yeah. So what is your just basic view of the SAT now? Like, do you love it more, less? Do you think, how valid do you think it is? How much do you think schools should actually rely on it? Because to me, I'm still one of these. The SAT is a thing of is a tool of meritocracy.
Yeah.
And I don't think meritocracy is a dirty word, but every time you ever talk to somebody in your line of work, it always gets complicated really quickly.
I don't want to meet the moment of how you just set me up to fail, but I'll make it a little complicated. I'm a huge defender that we should have the tests right now. That the moment of setting them aside was a dumb experiment and it didn't work. But I'm a 2 cheers for standardized testing guy, because I think it's clear, Sawhill stuff, Brad Wilcox, whoever we want to go to for some of the network effects around the great benefits of coming from 2-parent homes or people who have more money. I think the SAT is significantly less valuable now than it was 40 or 50 years ago, because there's a prep industry so that rich people end up with much, much better scores than lower middle class people, and not necessarily because of actual merit, but because of a support industry. So I'm a 2 cheers for standardized testing guy. We are glad we have him here. We have Ivy League level admissions at the University of Florida. We had 74,600 applicants this winter. So we have to exclude, the overwhelming majority of everybody who applies. And the SAT is a better proxy for a big part of that bundle than something that would be done subjectively. But I don't think standardized tests are the be all and end all. And I do think what you're really looking for in a neighbor and in a worker is some great complement of EQ and IQ. You want grit, and you want people who believe in human dignity and want to work on a team, and you like native ability, but what you'd like more is people who work really hard and grow and steward the gifts they've been given. Yeah,
I mean, I'm fine with 2 cheers for standardized tests. I think if pressed, that's my position too. I will say though, since you name dropped Brad Wilcox, there is a chicken or the egg problem, right? Is like successful 2-parent families have more resources, and they have more resources because they're 2-parent families, right? I mean, it's like and so I take the point that you're kind of testing for family stability and that kind of stuff when you have access to tutors and all that, but so be it. I mean, universities can't be in the business of remediating all sorts of other social dysfunctions, and so the fact that bourgeois values actually lead to better material results should be an argument for helping persuade people to adopt bourgeois values. But that's me being on the outside of your
Well, just I agree with everything you're saying, and I'm saying something in addition. So this is not a but, this is truly an and. I would still rather admit a 1,300 kid that comes from a really rough background that's kicked butt over the last 36 months than a 1,400 kid who had everything handed to him or her on a silver platter. Because the trajectory of the curve from 18 to 22, I want us to do more life change for kids. And I think we can help that person who is on a pretty great hockey stick trajectory, even though objectively they're at a 1,300 today instead of a 1,400.
So, as you know, I travel in a rich ecosystem of nerdery. When I told friends that, some of whom you know, some of whom are your friends as well, that I was having you on, I said, what should I talk to them about? There were a bunch of different things. I mean, we can come back to the campus stuff, or the protest stuff in a bit, but it shows you the ecological niche that I come from. The consensus response was ask them about the Hamilton Center. For listeners who don't know, well, why don't you explain what the Hamilton Center is? Because I'm kind of interested to hear how you describe it rather than how I would describe it.
I am a zealot on this place, so but I'm also gonna say, obviously, you've been doing your homework from 2 weeks ago to 2 days ago, because if you'd been asking the last 2 days, they would have only talked about the College World Series. I almost came like shirtless with a big tattoo. We're going to Omaha. So at some point, you got to let me gloat a little bit about the Gators being national runners up last year in baseball, and this year being the Cinderella story to go back to the center of the universe that is Omaha, Nebraska. But on Hamilton, it is an extraordinary project. The university here has 16 colleges and schools. Hamilton will become our 17th eventually. So it's an institute now, but it'll become a college or school at some point. And think of it as a really idealistic liberal arts college in the middle of the University of Florida. There have been different national outlets or in Florida outlets that tried to call it a right wing this or that. It's just not true. It is a liberal arts new startup inside this place that probably is the most sought after job in higher education right now. We don't have the data on everybody else and what their applicants look like, but we've hired a few dozen professors to teach at Hamilton. And we had about 1,200 applicants over an 11-month period. And I happen to know some of the people who've applied that are all over the political spectrum, but nobody cares. Like, we have a bunch of people applying from the far left, the center right, whatever. That's not what their job is. Their job is to teach Shakespeare or diplomatic history. Or we're building the PPE, the largest humanities major at Oxford and Cambridge is a combined major, philosophy, politics, and economics. We're having a version that's going to be PPEL, philosophy, politics, economics, and essentially a pre-law program. And our PPE program, our history subset of folks that are, in different interdisciplinary groups, but are trained as historians or trained as political scientists or trained as philosophers, literature professors. We are getting some of the best applicants anywhere in the country wanting to come teach at Hamilton. And we hired Will Imboden from the University of Texas. I used to be a professor at the University of Texas 20 years ago. And Will has come over and he's going to be our founding dean. He's the director now, but will be the dean when we upgrade it. And he is kicking butt, whining and dining people who it's like a little secret Alcoholics Anonymous group, as Ivy League professors say, I don't know if I can give up the brand addiction I have to the top 12 school I've been at for the last 30 years. I thought this was the center of the world. But what you guys are doing is much more interesting because you don't do ideological indoctrination. You just want to get kids to fall in love with reading great literature and actually studying history and not reducing it to monocausal identity issues. And so it's a super fun moment for us.
Yeah, no, I got to say, I think Imboden's a really great guy. I was very impressed with everything that was going on. And, it seems to me like it's such weird low-hanging fruit. And yet at the same time, the incentives not to pick the fruit are so strong in some of these institutions. Like when people ask me about it, I say, I honestly think they just want to do what you think you're supposed to do in college, which is like teach the stuff.
Yeah.
That people are actually supposed to learn. And so you're not going to get a lot of talk about intersectionality in Hamlet or settler colonialism in Melville. You're going to like learn what Melville was trying to tell in his book, and so like you came up through you climbed the greasy pole of academia back in the day, and you trained in history. I think the single greatest indictment of the professional academic historical universe is that military history is basically being erased from higher ed. And if you look at any bookstore, to the extent any are left, the history section, it's about 60% military history and 35% biography.
Yeah.
And yet those two approaches, and it's almost all done by non-academic historians, because you have to do, lesbian poetry in antebellum Alabama instead. And what do you? Is it just the problem of navel gazing among the and sort of guild mentality among the professional academia? Is it the long march to the institutions that just says we're not going to let go of our sort of our Gnostic understanding of what people need to have? Why is it that it's so hard to get history departments just to teach like normal history?
Your phrase "low hanging fruit" is so great. We have a giant announcement we're going to make of a historian soon. I can't cross that line yet today, but I'm super excited about somebody that's going to be joining Hamilton as one of the top historians on earth. And it is rare to be able to look at an academic history department and say, this is one of the great historians that you'd want smart, educated people to spend their time reading for exactly the reasons you're naming. One, the nichification of research, right? Research done right, great historiography, should be studying texts that do engage a specialist community that is probably narrow, but so that that small wheel can turn a bigger wheel. It should turn a crank to get to a story that actually matters and that lots of thoughtful citizens should want to read. And yet the nichification of academia has people regularly proud of the fact that they write for a journal read by dozens. And then they think that's the end of the story. And then many of these faculty members try to seize control of academic committees under the guise, sort of the false sense of what shared governance is, so that they can control demand through the core curriculum into these nichified classes so that they can continue to proceed up enough research publications to try to get tenure without ever speaking to a generalist audience. And at the end of the day, a great history dissertation should produce a book that can be read by a wide audience. Right now, it's often a couple thousand pages of academic jargon that no normal person who knows that we're all headed toward our deathbeds would ever want to waste your time reading. And so you've got a dozen of the best read historians in America, or a dozen of the best read historians who write outside from academia. You got some that are hybrids, and Andrew Roberts type by background, but basically you want a McCullough, or you want somebody that doesn't try to get an academic job anymore. And that's a shame. And Hamilton's a great opportunity for us to say, no, we want you to write about big and important topics that generally educated people, which is who we should be trying to graduate every spring, would read while they're your students and want to continue reading when they get out into the world. I'll say one thing about the University of Florida's rise. This place over the last dozen years has gone from about the number 54 to the number 28 ranked institution in the country, public or private. At the public level, we've gone from number 19 to number 5 or 6 in U.S. News, and to number 1 in the Wall Street Journal. But we're still big, right? I have 6,398 professors. Mm-hmm. And so you can't turn an aircraft carrier from the center. You need to be able to build some new things that become, a lighthouse that people say, hey, let's go toward that. And to move the university as a whole, we need some of these early first fruits that are exciting and sexy and persuasive. And that is happening at Hamilton. And even though the New York Times seems to want to write a piece, about once every 3 weeks, talking about the politicization of higher education in the state of Florida, and it's usually just data free. It's just sort of nonsense of stuff that isn't right left. But the reality is there has been some politicization at an appropriations politics level because we've had price controls here for 14 years. So our median kid, our price has been locked at $6,300 for 14 years. And our median kid has a almost $1,450 SAT. And so they get an $8,000 Bright Future scholarship from Tallahassee, which means they get paid to be a student. We're negatively priced. We're a service academy with no service requirement. So they get a rebate check to be a student. But it means that I have to spend a lot of time in Tallahassee begging for money. And a lot of times you're just trying to avoid problems. Like we need money to make our budget work. And you worry that appropriations politics is going to try to put handcuffs on you or constrain this, that, or the other thing. One of the great things that I want to compliment Tallahassee for doing, this happened, I've been here 15 months. This happened about 18 months ago, is they passed and Governor DeSantis signed into law a direct hire authority. So I can just hire professors. The president can just straight away hire new professors here. We don't have to go through long and arduous committee processes. In general, that should not be the normal way that an institution works, because on Aristotle's, deliberation versus execution distinction, committees deliberate better than individuals. Individuals execute better than committees. But a lot of times these things become decentralized bureaucratic processes where nobody who's ever said anything that offends anybody, except the dominant monoculture ideology, those folks could never possibly be hired. And so one reason, I'll stop with this, but one reason why a lot of great history is written outside the academy instead of inside is that if you're a really great storyteller, you're just not willing to sit around forever and have committee after committee after committee after committee be able to exercise veto authority over what you do. And here we're going to just hire a lot of great brains and scholars and storytellers across a lot of different disciplines. And we can just go fast to add real talent to your low-hanging fruit point. And that's what's happening in Hamilton right now.
So like, it's funny. I don't know if you know him. I won't out him here, but one of my oldest friends has a PhD in history from Columbia, and at his dissertation defense, one of the Marxist professors said, well, first of all, let me just compliment you. This is really well written. Like it reads like a good piece of journalism. And my friend thought, oh my God, they're going to reject my thesis, because like this was the worst thing you could say about a piece of writing, was that it was well written and accessible. And but I think it gets to this larger point of like the professionalization and nicheification. That's nicheification, not Nietzscheification of higher ed, is that you get these shibboleths, right? You get this forms a gnosis with a silent G, right? Yeah. That prevents outsiders from getting in. And it does get to this sort of weird question I have of, so getting back to the campus protest stuff, I mean, again, Florida stayed out of most of that storm because it had a captain who wanted to keep it out of that storm. But there was a big debate in my world about, is this the product of, is this ideas have consequences, and these kids have been taught this pretty transgressive, pretty, anti-American, anti-Western, and settler colonialism, oppressor oppressed, intersectionality, go through the whole list, critical race this, critical law that. Or is it the fact that just as a culture, we privilege people who protest, that we think it's sort of like at a lot of schools, you haven't had the full college experience unless you've had shouted through a megaphone and handcuffed yourself to something. And so are we just sort of getting what we subsidize culturally? Because this sort of gets to this point about the ignorance of, as you said earlier, there are a lot of idiots in these protests, but some of them aren't idiots. Some of them are really smart, and they're just actually really radical. Do you think this is because the system encourages this, or is this on a sort of separate track? Like, as a historian, if you're going to look back and say, how the hell do you get kids at Columbia, shouting, I don't know, gas the Jews? Where does this come from? What would be your answer to it?
Well, I mean, at one level, we've just got a ton of lonely people who've never been able to be on a team doing something important, right? So there are people who are finding communities in these protest camps. Protest is not a good or a bad thing. The question is, what idea are you advocating, right? And the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the late 50s and early to mid 60s was doing some really important special stuff about universal human dignity. I mean, MLK was one of my key childhood heroes, and I understand the impulse for us to have wished we'd been able to be with him at the March on Washington. And you know, there are key moments in U.S. history that are deeply impressed on us in a way that should make people yearn to be a part of the we. Most questions are not really Manichaean good versus evil, especially not policy questions. They're a whole bunch of gray about trade-offs. And there are people who have fetishized protest to make it seem like the act of protest is itself the thing. Mm-hmm. And I think we should be getting deeper to the question of what's the idea that you're advocating for. And we should recognize that protest done right should aim at persuasion. These protests have been so weird. The Peggy Noonan column in the Wall Street Journal where she couldn't get anybody to talk to her, who hadn't been trained, and all the mask wearing, all the face covering, all the just weird symbolism of I'm a part of an in-group. I'm not mostly angry at a lot of these people. I'm sad for them, right? Because I think loneliness is a key driver of this. And I think part of the problem here is that the protests are the poisoned fruit of a bad tree. For too long, higher education has tried to teach kids to divide the world into immutable categories of your intersectionality point, oppressor and oppressed. And the vast majority of the time, that's not really the most important or the right frame. And so part of that tries to make protest a symbolic moment of your college experience. And then education is just peripheral. I think it'd be far better if these kids were spending their time in classrooms wrestling through texts. You said that critical this, critical that. One of my secondary fields when I was in grad school was religion in early modern Europe. Long ago, it used to be called Renaissance and Reformation. And Heiko Obermann, the great Luther scholar from Harvard, used to teach his graduate students that you had to write a lot of book reviews as what you did in graduate seminars. And one of the requirements was you had to spend more than 51% of all your time lending a voice before you could transition to raising a voice. The vast majority the ceiling of critique allowed in any book review was 49%, because for 51%, you had to be able to summarize somebody else's argument. They'd done the work, be humble enough to come along and be able to summarize it in a way they can recognize. We just don't do enough education that way anymore.
So big picture, what do you think higher education looks like 20 years from now? Are you going to see, because like there was a lot of talk about how a lot of those middle tier schools were just going to dry up with the trends that we've got in the crashing of college bound population and all the rest. Like big picture, I mean, I'm sure you think that University of Florida represents a positive trend, but like the broader trends, where do you see it going? What is, I think even now you know this better than I, but I think the typical college student is like in his mid-20s and goes to a place where he's trying to get a specific, community college type thing, and it's not the picture of this elite, kid from Harvard, Yale, Brown, or whatever. What does college look like for the normal American in 15 to 20 years?
Yeah, great. So let me set UF aside for a minute because we're an oasis in a desert. I'll go full Homer. But broadly speaking, I think higher ed is in an adapt or die moment. And so let's say something about the demographics today, but then let's jump ahead to your point, 15 to 20 years out. We have in our head the idea that everybody in college is 18 to 22. They're full-time in school. They barely have to work at all. They leave home. They go away to college. They live in a residential campus experience, and they get to spend the vast majority of their time on their learning. That's like 20% of the people who are in higher education today. The modal form is a 29-year-old single mom who's going to school 1/3 time, working full time. She's at her 4th institution on her 3rd major, and she's trying to cobble enough credits from all these institutions, many of which don't transfer, to finish with a nursing degree. And she wants a BSN, but she wonders if she has to compromise to an RN because there's not time to get through the prerequisites that didn't align for customer service for that student at that directional state university. I think those kinds of schools, absent a drift towards socialism that just allows rent seeking through lobbying to protect that form, I think those schools are in big, big trouble. And that's okay with me, because I think right now we think 4 years, 8 semesters, 15 credit hours a semester, cookie cutter stuff. And I don't think it's good for the vast majority of kids. I want to see that unbundled. Again, I'm not talking about the University of Florida, because I think there are great 45, 48-month experiences that people can have. But what I really think should happen is we should have bigger ambitions for the core curriculum and bigger ambitions for people's navigation through their major, and recognize that in their major, in their pre-vocational stuff, they should have more come and go experiences with work and internships. They should have more flexible framing around what I think of as hybrid modalities around their classroom experiences. Some classes, I'm a history professor, so I'm biased, need 15 people around a table wrestling with a text. You don't just need the table, you sometimes need actual food on the table. There's community around things that implicate your worldview. But accounting, there's no data that shows a 300-to-1 accounting class is different really than a 60-to-1 accounting class. And there's some data that would show 1,000,000-to-1 or infinity-to-1 with a few high frequency, low stakes quizzes around a lot of assessment, and then some breakout groups to free you from the remedial bottlenecks can be done at 3 and 5 person level. I think the vast majority of disciplines should be delivered in a hybrid modality. So where you have a lot of synchronicity, you have a lot of cohorting, you have some community, but you don't need to take synchronicity and co-locality and assume they're always the same thing. Time and place are not the same thing. You don't always have to be in the same room, even though you should be synchronous with a lot of your friends in second circle continuum. And so what I want to have happen, you're going to chuckle. You think I've done...
I'm just loving listening. You're going so full Mackenzie, synchronicity, co-locality. I mean, it's
But it actually matters.
You're going native on me. Go on.
Yeah, so let's talk about the two extremes, because the middle is the best option on this stuff. Pre-Gutenberg Revolution, you had to go up to Oxford or Cambridge to go to school because you didn't have any books. And so you had to go sit in a room where somebody who had books, maybe they were a crappy lecturer, but they had the book. And so they could read the book aloud, and then they could comment on the book, and you owned a little bit, you had leisure, you had some time. You had a little bit of paper and you had a little bit of ink. And so you could take notes while some great sage read a book aloud to you and made some comments on it. That's the basis of our in-classroom experience today. If people think the technological revolution creates this other thing where you could always be alone watching lectures on YouTube and taking correspondence course quizzes, and you're all by yourself in your grandma's basement, well, that's a pretty crappy revolution for the digital world to have bought. The old pre-Gutenberg Oxford model wasn't good enough, but this lonely thing is crap. And so the right answer is to say, what are the modalities for us to be together, time and place together? What's the stuff that you might want to do at the same time, but you can do some of this stuff on Zoom, and then I can get back into the lab I'm working at Mayo Jacksonville, getting to help do partial lung transplants. So I want more practical experiences for kids and more meaningful, deep engagement with text. And I think the unbundling is coming because the concept of professor, if I can nerd one more time on you, the concept of professor is still too locked in our head. We should disaggregate the roles a professor does. 100 years ago, we used the term doctor as an honorific. But we also thought it was just a good enough term because I wasn't expert on any part of the body. So what do I care if we're talking oncology, gynecology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology? It's just doctor. They know more than I do. That's good enough for me. We still use the word doctor, but we don't really mean we're indifferent to the specialties. We care whether you mean anesthesiologist or gynecologist for this next hour that we're together. I think the word professor is still too generic. And I don't mean specialty here. I don't mean historian versus biologist. I don't mean surgeon of ear, nose, and throat or hips and knees. I mean the difference between designing a great syllabus, being a great sage on the stage lecturer, being a great seminar leader around a table with only 15 people really wrestling with a text, assessment and grading, life coach and mentoring, helping you figure out where you're going to get your next internship. Audio visual. It's nuts that we still pretend a professor should deliver every lecture in their lecture class. We would never do that with books. Like I taught a history class this year. If I'm assigning 6 books in the class, the right number to be written by me is 0 or 1 of the 6 I assign, not 5 or 6 of the 6. And yet, if I'm lecturing 3 times a week for an hour, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 13 weeks, we still pretend I should deliver all 39 lectures. There's no way in hell I'm equally good at all 39 lectures. We should definitely get Obermann off YouTube about Luther when we get to that week in the class. And so I think we're going to unbundle these classes, and that's a good thing. And we need the assessment to be more rigorous and more real, and therefore externalized from the professor who doesn't really want to do the grading and sure as hell doesn't want to admit a bunch of the kids in this class deserve a D+. And so we should move the assessment outside the classroom more. And we should have a lot more experiences that don't just look like the classroom, but when you're in the classroom, it ought to be the most idealistic, romantic version of what a classroom could be.
So more tests, right?
I mean, dumbass. I mean, more elite and more practical at the same time.
No, I get it. No. I just mean, like, it seems to me in the world of AI, you're going to have so many kids not learning how to write if you let them do it at home.
Yeah.
So, or in the dorm or whatever. So you have to have the grading and accountability thing has to be an actual test of their abilities where they're not relying on these tools that allow them to fake it, right? That's all I mean.
Yes, but. So I mean exactly that, except most of them should be high frequency, low stakes, right? It should be that they want to do the assessments so that they can have, I don't know if you did this when you were a kid. When I was like 5 or 6, my mom would sometimes, after you'd brush your teeth, you claim you brushed your teeth before bed. She's like, that's nonsense. You were in there 4.3 seconds.
Right. She checked the brush, see if it was wet. Red
pills.
Yeah.
It would leave all the plaque on your teeth. And it turned out I'd done like a 4% good enough job brushing my teeth. I want our students to be the kind of gritty people who want to be learning. And so they want more assessments to figure out what they've figured out and what they still need to do more of. So I want way more tests, yes, but I want maybe fewer of them to matter. They're en route assessment tools.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave that to you to figure out. I mean, it seems to me they got to matter a little. Because otherwise, you want kids to take them seriously, and so they have to have some stake to them, right?
Yes.
All right. So last rounding up, because I know you got to go. You were kind of at the forefront of a really kind of depressing and terrible movement by which I mean quality people leaving Washington. And our friend Mike Gallagher, he's left. Patrick McHenry. I mean, basically the grown-ups, the people who actually want to do something constructive, the people who don't think that talking to the other side is collaborating with the enemy. They're taking their marbles and going home. Now, I don't blame you personally for your decisions, but there is sort of a collective action problem that you kind of represent for a lot of people. And so, I mean, will you voluntarily give me your pound of flesh here and apologize to the country, or how do you respond to this? Because there's no way you haven't heard this 1,000 times.
So let's distinguish between the House, the Senate, and the executive branch for a minute. So first of all, you named mostly people in the House, and I've only run for one job ever. I mean, I served 2 terms or parts of second term, but I've never been in the House, so I don't mean to be disrespectful of it. But the House was meant to be a fairly quick response populist body. So the House is obviously super dysfunctional, feels like idiocracy, where somebody's going to just machine gun the whole ceiling soon to techno lights. I had a reporter one time jam a camera into my rib cage, like hard enough that I'm pretty sure I got a bruise out of it. And she said, "You've been ducking us all day." And I'm, really? I didn't know I was. Where were you looking for me? What's the question? And she said, "We just want to know what do you think about what Marjorie Taylor Greene said, about what AOC said, about what Trump tweeted?" that I don't give a rip, and that this is just complete nonsense and you're enabling the crazy. So I am sad that the House is in its decline, but I'm not that surprised. And I don't think it's the, most important institution in American life. But the Senate, you didn't name Kyrsten Sinema. Washington, D.C., she and I don't have the same politics, but Washington, D.C. is going to be a worse place because Kyrsten's leaving. She was an adult who would wrestle through issues and try to figure out what the perspectives and values were and regions were that were driving, legislation to have a shot to pass or not. The Senate has been on a decline since cameras were put in every room. Mm-hmm. And as long as there are cameras in every room, it defers for maybe not just years, maybe decades, the ability for the Senate to actually function as a deliberative body again. And it was clear that it's not just a right-left thing. On my side of the aisle, the vast majority of senators were also unwilling to oppose the immediacy, which is sort of the opposite of the purpose of the Senate, of having cameras and performative moments put in every institution. I said at the beginning that I missed the Intelligence Committee. Mark Warner was a great chairman. Richard Burr was a great chairman. There's a lot that they have in common. There were things they didn't have in common, but both of them were really great chairmen of Senate Intel, partly because there's never a reason to be a grandstanding fool there, because there are no grandstands. There are no cameras. There are no sound bites. You didn't get to own some lib and create a viral something out of it. And so the Senate, to be a deliberative body again, has to have spaces where people can actually deliberate. And right now, we haven't figured out the media ecology of how we stop giving the most voice to the loudest people trying to go narrow but super deep into their own echo chambers. So that problem is big and deep, and America's in trouble, but no one person matters all that much in trying to stop that problem. But the idea is we should be persuading your listeners and lots of other thoughtful grasstop citizens across the country to try to persuade Senate candidates that the Senate ought to look different than the House of Representatives. And right now, it mostly doesn't. And when you lose the filibuster, as is probably likely, you'll have yet another piece of this going away. The Senate needs to reform itself and want to be a deliberative body again. But I think we basically face a cultural crisis about how we consume information. And we need to have people who want to speak to 70% of the people on some topics. And right now, there really aren't avenues and channels for that. So media reform and diet, information consumption, diet stuff are really central. The Senate isn't the center of the world. The White House isn't the center of the world. Communities are the center of America. And I'm blessed that I got to move on to one of those really great communities. And I think that's real work. And I'm glad that I get to be able to steward some of my energies here for a while. But I think America's reform depends most likely on people being able to consume information with more skepticism of clickbait, or we'll need the highly unlikely thing of a Cincinnatus-like president at some point, or president-elect, who tries to force the legislature to do the legislating again. We'll need to move the most important centers of power in Washington, D.C. outside of the administrative agencies and back into the legislative branch where it's accountable to politics. And it's super unlikely that you're going to have anybody who has a George Washington 1796 kind of catechetical effect on America again. But Washington's farewell address was the most read political document in the United States. The Bible was the most read document, but the most read political document from the American Revolution until the Civil War wasn't the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't the Constitution. It was George Washington's farewell address. And that kind of impulse is going to need to come from an executive leader again at some point to force or enable the legislature to reform itself.
So I know your answer to this, and I feel I have to ask it anyway because other people don't know your answer to this. But there was another college president who, Cincinnatus-like, went on to become president of the United States. He was a good Republican named Dwight Eisenhower. Now you have not liberated Europe, I gotta say. So
I never get credit for it. I think I did.
I mean, a couple of McKinsey deals. Liberating Europe. I mean, tomato. But the point is have you foreclosed? I know you're going to tell me yes. But have you foreclosed the possibility of running for office again and getting back into politics?
Yeah, it is definitely not been my plan in any way. And I came on here wanting to talk about the College World Series. And, like a jerk, you've given me no pitches down the middle in Omaha this weekend. I love where I am. I'm having a blast. We have a wonderful team. We have a really big opportunity to love our neighbor and serve where we are. And I've made the right choice for me, but I'm really glad that there are a lot of good and faithful people still working in that. What was the Jack Kennedy line? Working up in that city with northern charm and southern efficiency.
That's right. Yeah.
Important place to labor. I'm glad I'm not there.
All right. President Ben Sasse. Okay, I can say that,
Will you come to the College World Series this weekend? I'm putting you on the spot right now. Come to Omaha on Saturday.
Dear Lord.
Go to Omaha because I'm in Gainesville, but I get to go to Omaha. It's pretty great. I'm in a great place. I'm going to a great place. Come visit.
I will take it under advisement. We'll talk. Your people will talk to my people and we'll figure it out. I apologize. Is there one last point you want to make about the college, World Series thing, or you want to get it out of your system so you don't have it?
I'll go full on Nebraska homer for a minute. It is the greatest amateur sporting event in America, besides every college football game that exists. But still, outside of the religion that is football, the College World Series is the greatest event. It is straight up Field of Dreams for 11 days in the middle of June, which is like 12 days before Nebraska becomes unbearably hot, right before 4th of July. 8 teams come from all over the country, and it's like they're George Will's old, Men at Work book. Mm-hmm. All these boys who are now men getting to still play this game, and all their fan bases come every year. All the bars in downtown Omaha that have Jello shot competitions. There's been a lot of grieving because Arkansas and LSU and Ole Miss all got eliminated before the final 8. And so there are going to be a lot of bar bankruptcies without those drunks coming to town. You got to love people in Mississippi who put on their license plates, "We drink and drive." Like, hotty toddy. This is who we are. We're a bunch of drunks and we're headed north. But come to Omaha. It is no one who's ever come to the College World Series has regretted it. The championship has been played for 81 years. And even though the NCAA usually only lets contracts for a national championship on a 1-year basis, it's been in Omaha 77 straight years. I promise you'll talk about it for 3 weeks on your show if you come.
We have a mutual friend. I don't want to get her in trouble here who wanted me, Jessica and I, Jessica says hello, by the way. We have a Sprinter RV now, which is just made for tailgating at exactly these sorts of events. Yeah. So, we'll take it under advisement.
1,209 miles from your house to the Chuck.
And with that, Ben Sasse, thanks for doing this. And hopefully we'll get you back.
Amen.